The passage of Jimmy Carter is a serious thing, given the fact that we look back and it's a reminder, sort of, as we look back on America and where we were and how far we've come. I think the general disposition toward Jimmy Carter was great, honest, in a way, extraordinary man. Presidency was mixed bag. That's probably sort of fair, but it may be a little unfair to Carter because he did some things that he was really ahead of his time on, and he was a transformational president after, particularly in the shadow of Nixon and Ford. Remember, he came out of that when the country was really wanting an honest broker as president, someone who really seemed to speak with a sense of allegiance to honesty, to sincerity. He was those things, and he was also a brilliant guy. We've got a quick package on him, and then we're going to talk to Rothmann and Spencer. I hope we're not keeping them too long, but here's a quick wrap package just to remind you of who Jimmy Carter was as president.
My name is Jimmy Carter, and I'm running for president.
He was the longest-living former president in U.S. history who redefined the post-presidency with his dedication to faith and public service. Outside of his native Georgia, Jimmy Carter was a virtually unknown politician when he ran for president in 1976. He grew up in the small town of Plains on a farm with no electricity or indoor plumbing. Carter attended the U.S. Naval Academy, studied nuclear physics, and worked in the nuclear submarine program. But his father's death brought him back home, where he ran the family peanut farm. In 1962, Carter entered the world of politics, serving 2 terms in the Georgia State Senate.
Jimmy Carter.
Before becoming governor. In the Old South, he was something new.
The time for racial discrimination is over.
But beyond Georgia, many still did not know who Carter was. He even stumped the panelists during an appearance on What's My Line in 1973. Just a year later, he announced he was running for president, a fresh voice stepping onto the national stage in the wake of Watergate and other scandals. The political outsider and born-again Christian was viewed by many as a welcome change. Carter narrowly defeated President Gerald Ford in the general election, becoming the first president from the Deep South in nearly a century. From the very start, Jimmy Carter signaled his would be a down-to-earth presidency, walking the entire way from the Capitol to the White House during his inauguration, and swapping a suit for a sweater as he discussed the energy crisis.
There's no way that I or anyone else in the government can solve our energy problems if you are not willing to help.
Once in the White House, however, Carter's lack of experience in Washington politics became a severe handicap. Congress blocked some of the key legislative initiatives he prioritized, but Carter found more success with matters of foreign policy, emerging as a champion of human rights.
No member of the United Nations can claim that mistreatment of its citizens is solely its own business.
The Camp David Accords, a major achievement of his presidency. Carter led marathon talks between Egypt's Anwar Sadat and Israel's Menachem Begin, brokering a historic peace treaty that is still in place today. A Soviet invasion of Afghanistan prompted Carter to boycott the Moscow Olympics. Then there was Iran, where dozens of Americans were taken hostage, the crisis consuming his final year in office.
Any encouraging news from Iran, Mr. President? No.
A mission to rescue the hostages ended in tragedy.
It was my decision to attempt the rescue operation. The responsibility is fully my own.
At home, when the economy tanked, so did Carter's popularity. Long lines at the pump became a familiar sight with widespread gas shortages.
The erosion of our confidence in the future.
Carter blamed the country's troubles on a crisis of confidence.
I'm a candidate.
His political weakness brought a challenge from Senator Ted Kennedy for the Democratic nomination in 1980, a race Carter won, only to face an even more formidable opponent, Ronald Reagan.
I'll bring new hope to America.
Jimmy Carter lost his bid for re-election in a landslide, but he never lost faith in himself or in his principles. Carter's love story was one for the ages. He married Rosalind Smith in 1946. The girl he knew throughout his childhood became not only his closest friend, but his most trusted advisor.
The best thing I ever did was marrying Rosalind. That's the pinnacle of my life.
They went on to have 4 children and more than 20 grandchildren and great-grandchildren. After leaving the White House, the Carters dedicated themselves to public service.
We made some very careful plans over a period of time, and now I would say that this is the best time of our life.
In 1982, they established the Carter Center, committed to advancing human rights and promoting democracy around the world. And in 2002, at age 78, Carter became only the 3rd American president to be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. His work for Habitat for Humanity spanned decades, and both Carters continued their work well into their 90s, celebrating milestone birthdays and anniversaries. In November 2023, Carter said goodbye to Rosalind, his wife of 77 years, the longest presidential marriage in history. Nearly a year later, in October, the former president was seen by the public for what would be the last time, celebrating his 100th birthday, punctuated with a Navy flyby. Carter died Sunday at his home in Georgia, surrounded by family. His son Chip saying, "My father was a hero, not only to me, but to everyone who believes in peace, human rights, and unselfish love." A leader who worked to serve not only his country, but the world.
I've had a wonderful life. I've had thousands of friends, and I've had an exciting and adventurous and gratifying existence.
Such an earnest and sincere guy, and remarkable. All right, now I wanted to bring 2 people on. One who's a presidential historian, that's John Rothmann, and the other who knew Jimmy Carter personally, and that's Spencer Christian. Welcome, guys. Appreciate you both being here. John, I'll start with you just because I feel as though Carter gets a little bit of a bad shake on his presidency. He did a lot. He doubled the national park system, first national legislation funding green energy. He was clearly way up ahead of his time on that. Major civil service and government ethics reforms. I just made a list of them here. Created FEMA, the Middle East Peace Accord, some of that stuff that was just noted there. I think it's eclipsed by the mess of the economy, by the hostage crisis, and of course the gas crisis, of course. Could you speak to a little bit how you square all of that and the Carter presidency?
First of all, I'm honored to be here with Spencer because he really knew the Carters, and the Carters called him a friend. And Spencer, I'm delighted to call you a friend as well.
Yeah, thank you, sir. I feel the same way.
Let me tell you, Jimmy Carter was not a great president, but he did great things. We remember him for not only the Camp David Accord, but the peace treaty between Israel and Egypt, which remains in place. We remember him for the Panama Canal. And interestingly enough, that's now a major issue in American politics. And yet it was Jimmy Carter who forced that decision to be made. And by the way, it was one vote, Senator Dennis DeConcini of Arizona, who put it across the finish line.
When you say it, I just want to be clear to everybody. You're talking about the fact that the Panama Canal, Carter made sure it went to Panama. Is that what you're saying?
Well, that was the only option.
Right, but I'm
either
just saying
we kept it or it went to Panama.
Right.
And you will recall, and most people don't remember this, that when the formal transfer took place, no one in the Clinton administration wanted the honor of going down there to have the transfer. The man who they sent was Jimmy Carter. And that was really quite a tribute to him. And of course, his environmental work was absolutely phenomenal. The amount of open space that he saved, the Alaska that he created, if you will, by preserving open spaces. There are so many things that he did well. His problem, I think, was he was a micromanager. He used to assign who could play on the White House tennis court. I think it was a downfall. And of course, there are many who will argue that when Iran and the situation with the Shah rolled around, it was Jimmy Carter who made the decision to pull the rug out from underneath the Shah. He believed, I believe sincerely, that he could get an orderly transition in Iran, and what we ended up with was the Ayatollah Khomeini. But you will remember something, that when Ronald Reagan won that decisive victory, when the inauguration was passed and the hostages were released, who did Ronald Reagan send to Germany to greet the hostages? None other than Jimmy Carter. And there's another interesting story, and I know we have limited time, but when Anwar Sadat was killed, President Reagan assigned 3 former presidents, Nixon, Ford, and Carter, to go to the funeral. Bob Dole joked, "Evil, hear no evil, see no evil, and evil," which everyone laughed about. But the
Yeah.
fun thing was that Ford and Carter became friends after being political opponents. And they made a deal that whoever died first, that one who survived would give the eulogy at the funeral. And Jimmy Carter gave perhaps one of the most eloquent eulogies for Gerald Ford when he died. There's no doubt that Jimmy Carter was a controversial president. There is no doubt that there is much to criticize. I was asked this morning to do just that, and I said, he just died. Let's give it a breath. One last point before we move on to Spencer, and that is in rating of the presidents. Jimmy Carter emerges about halfway in the pack. He's neither great nor a failure. He was sort of an average president. But I think that the most important single testimony to Jimmy Carter is that he was an exceptional former president. Okay, some of his successors objected to his interfering, but Jimmy Carter was a sincere, dedicated man who lived his faith. And I think that's the essence. You remember his autobiography, Why Not the Best? By the way, the first time I ever heard about that book, I visit used bookstores. I'm compulsive about it. But there was no used bookstore in this little town in Colorado. There was a Christian bookstore. 1975, I walked into the Christian bookstore, and you know what they're featuring? Why Not the Best by Jimmy Carter.
Oh, is that
published
right?
by
That's
an
wild.
evangelical press.
Yeah.
And Jimmy Carter harnessed people. Interesting to note, Jerry Falwell endorsed him in 1976, but endorsed Reagan in 1980. And
Isn't
that's
that
another
wild?
juxtaposition. How will he be remembered by history? I think he will be remembered as a man of deep faith, a man who tried hard to achieve peace, and a man who made it a point when he left the presidency with Habitat for Humanity, the Carter Center and its work on elections and the whole question of honesty in elections. I think he'll be remembered favorably, and indeed he should be. And we'll leave the criticisms of the Carter administration to others, at least on this day.
Well, certainly his post-presidential life was remarkable. I mean, unparalleled in terms of what he was giving back to the community. There's Trevor Starr saying, whether you think Jimmy Carter was a good president or not, I hope we can all agree that he was by far the greatest former president ever. He didn't play golf. He built houses for poor people. Yeah, that's a major reducto on what he did, because he also wrote books. He weighed in on the Middle East. He really... he was a thinker, and he continued to try to influence policy after his presidency was over. Spencer, you are so lucky to have interacted with him in so many different settings as a personal friend.
Yeah, so fortunate. Yeah, and I keep pinching myself. Have I really lived this life that I got to know this wonderful, incredible human being? Not just Jimmy Carter, but Rosalind as well. The two Carters. They both dedicated their lives post presidency to serving God through serving humankind. And as John pointed out, they went into the most impoverished nations in the world to work to eradicate diseases, to vaccinate children, to improve the quality of life for the poorest people on the planet, and of course, building houses for Habitat for Humanity. He is, as you said, one of you said earlier, he's a man who lived his faith for sure.
Yeah, and his interaction with you, I think, started on Good Morning America, but then it continued past that. In other words, you guys sparked to each other, I guess, there on
Spencer,
GMA.
tell the story of your relationship with Carter. It's marvelous. Really a great story.
Okay, well, it was 1988. The Democratic National Convention was going on in Atlanta, and Good Morning America went down for a week of live coverage. And the first day of the convention, I was sent to the Carter Presidential Library in Atlanta to interview former President Jimmy Carter. You may recall in those days, he was an avid runner. He ran miles and miles every day. So I'm out early in the morning setting up with the camera person to interview the former president. We can see him out there jogging around the grounds of the library with the Secret Service guy. And he comes running up to me, panting and sweating. And he says, "Hi, Spencer, I'm Jimmy Carter. Nice to meet you." And I'm thinking, this man needs no introduction. And then the next words out of his mouth were, "We want you to know how much the Carter family appreciates how kind you were to Billy when you interviewed him years ago." I had interviewed Billy Carter, the naughty Carter family guy. I interviewed Billy Carter in the brother. I interviewed him in 1980 when everyone else who had interviewed him was trying to make him look like a buffoon or a redneck. And I didn't want to try to rob the man of his humanity. So I let him reveal who he was without my having to show people who they wanted to see that he might be. Anyhow, so Jimmy Carter says to me, the Carter family really appreciates your kindness and how gracious you were to Billy. And that, right away, we just had a personal connection. So my next encounter was doing a live remote for GMA from the site of a Habitat for Humanity build about a year or two later down in DC. And I stayed after the broadcast and just hung out with the Carters, got to know them, worked with them. I hammered enough nails to say that I participated in building the house. But what's most memorable for me about spending that day with them was just watching them interact with each other and with other people. I'm sure you've heard a lot about how deeply in love Jimmy and Rosalind Carter were. They were. I mean, they are always holding hands as they're walking together. They gazed lovingly into each other's eyes. And that's how they were on every occasion that I saw them over the next 30 years. Unbelievable.
Yeah, really something. You're right. That personal
Spencer, I gotta
relationship.
just ask.
Yeah.
Tell them about the event that they asked you to MC.
Oh, so all right. So in 1999, by this time I had several encounters with the Carters. I was invited to MC his 75th birthday celebration in Americus, Georgia. A formal affair, about 1,000 people attending, all in black tie. Dignitaries and diplomats, and Senator Max Cleland was there, and ABC's Sam Donaldson was there, and I'm emceeing this thing, right?
Wow.
So, and then 20 years later, I was invited back to MC his 95th. Actually, it was a joint celebration of his 95th and Mrs. Carter's 92nd. But I think the story John wants me to tell is this. There was a break when one of the performers was setting up backstage in 1999 when I was emceeing that big event. And I was asked to fill about 9 or 10 minutes while this group was setting up musical instruments. So I had pretty much run out of Carter stories to tell at that point. But I remembered, a little bit about my interaction with Billy. And you two may recall, and I'm sure your audience members, some of them, recall that when Jimmy Carter first ran for president in 1976, he did a Playboy interview and he talked about his faith, and he
said in his heart.
He had committed lust in his heart, right? Then everyone made jokes about the fact that he had committed lust in his heart. So as I'm filling this 9-minute gap, I talked about having met Billy Carter, and I talked about how I felt before I met Jimmy Carter and how I felt a connection with Billy. I said, we really had a lot in common. I said, Billy liked drinking beer, and when I was a younger man, I drank a little beer. Billy worked at a gas station, and when I was in college, I worked at a gas station. And Billy and I both had brothers who committed lust in their hearts. So there was a momentary silence in the crowd. Everybody was looking to see how the Carters would react. When they saw both Jimmy and Rosalind laughing, then there was uproarious laughter that went on for about 5 minutes.
Oh, that's terrific. That really, you took a chance with that line. That's so marvelous.
Took a big chance. Yeah.
Oh, that's just true. Well, I mean, the quality of the man, I think, never in doubt. I think in a way, a lot of the political forces in Washington, just to speak frankly, worked against him in large measure. He was, as that package, the video package that we ran indicated, viewed as an outsider. And there is a quality in Washington of, if you're from the outside, you're going to get bitch slapped by Washington. They're very tough that way. It's a closed club. And I feel as though much of his presidency suffered from that. And then, of course, I just want to touch on this from a political standpoint, because it's mentioned here. Carol mentions he started the Departments of Education and of Energy, was undermined by Reagan's undermining during the campaign Carter presidency by making a deal with the Iranians not to release captives till Reagan was inaugurated. That is true, by the way. And I wanted to ask you both, I guess maybe John, because it's a pure political question, if you felt as though there was a little bit of that Washington and GOP hand in creating an environment with the gas crisis and then, of course, with the Iranian hostage crisis ultimately that really kneecapped his presidency toward the end.
Yeah, Carter had a lot of self-inflicted wounds as president. And maybe that's unavoidable when you're president of the United States. But Jimmy Carter was a good man. He was not a great president. And that was his problem. And of course, when Teddy Kennedy announced he was going to run against Jimmy Carter for the nomination, all hell broke loose. And I'd remind you that Kennedy defeated Carter in both the California and New York primaries, which was a major blow to Jimmy Carter.
So you're saying he was politically hobbled already, is what I get from you.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Look,
okay.
you remember the great Malays speech in which he never mentioned the word Malays, but it was almost an apology for not being able to succeed. And in politics, a bluff is better than an admission of guilt.
Well,
and I think
we've certainly learned that. I'll tell you this, as a last coda, I remember Dan Rather doing a sit-down interview with him for 60 minutes, and he asked Jimmy Carter, how would you rate your presidency? And Carter, always honest. This speaks to how honest he was, and contemplative and reflective. He thought for a second and he said, I'd say B minus, C plus, maybe a C.
Yes.
And I thought, oh my God. I mean, no one's going to reelect somebody who, is a C president by his own yardstick, his own appraisal.
Mark, are you better off today than you were 4 years ago?
Yeah.
Well, that was a real tough
Famous
spot.
line.
Yeah,
That was
real
a
tough because
And you may
line.
remember Ronald Reagan saying, "There you go again." So there were all sorts of things.
But I mean, I think the gas
quickly,
lines and the Iranian hostage crisis that created as he circled the drain politically, that made it almost impossible to really make a charge.
Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell, you'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.